Hello friends, it's Dan. Welcome back. Welcome to a plastic miniature review, in this case of the Wargames Atlantic Halfling Cavalry, produced for their classic fantasy range. And I want you to know up front, this is sponsored by Wargames Atlantic. They sent this to me to review for you guys. So appreciate that from them. I'm very grateful for their ongoing support of the channel here. And I'm excited for this one in particular because this is, I think, the first time that they're going back to revisit a very early set. I think that their Halflings for their classic fantasy range was one of the very first sets that they put out. It might be the first set that they put out, and I have a review of that set up on the channel. It's a wonderful kit. The only issue with it is because it's one of the earliest ones. I actually think that it is like half a sprue in size. I believe from a layout standpoint they were doing like two totally different sets on either side of a mold, and so as a result it is functionally half of a sprue in terms of like bits, numbers, and layout. So that's a stark contrast, I think, from what they do now. So what's on that sprue is really awesome. I just wanted more of it in basically all cases. So this is cool because not only are we going back to kind of revisit something that they did at the very beginning of the company's formation, we're going back and revisiting something that I think deserved a little bit more in the way of bits. One thing to pay attention to here too is with Wargames Atlantic, you gotta watch out for model count. In this case there's 10 models. We're used to something between like 10 to 16 models in a cavalry box in 1/56 scale, as these are. But from Wargames Atlantic, sometimes it's going to be 12, sometimes it's going to be 15. In this case it's going to be 10. It really just depends. So that's something to pay attention to. Box art is lovely as ever. I normally am not a huge fan of these like atmospheric shots in the front. They always have a great illustration over on the one side, and they have kind of a picture, an action shot of miniatures. We saw in like the Baron's War line that they photoshopped them out. So this is fine. This is actually maybe the first time where like I really like it like this. Maybe it's just because the Shire that they're representing there is so particularly atmospheric, but then also that the miniatures are especially well painted, I think. And on the back, a little blurb about the Halflings and what you can do with this set. So inside, I've already taken everything out, as is customary from my reviews. What you're going to get are 5 sprues of 2 models apiece. And something to be aware of with all Wargames Atlantic sets, really a number of manufacturers don't include bases anymore, but all Wargames Atlantic sets that are not tied to a specific rule set, like Baron's War, don't come with bases. So that's the case here. There's no bases. You have to source them yourself, but that's fine. Most of us are accustomed to doing that. One other interesting layout note is that I mentioned there are 5 sprues that contain both the mount and the rider. We're, for most manufacturers, used to having 2 separate sprues of the mount and the rider, but in this case they're all combined. Once again, 5 sprues, 10 miniatures, 2 miniatures apiece. So if you're new here, particular welcome to you. What we're going to do is isolate one of these sprues. I'm going to go through it in detail, give you a breakdown on all the bits. We're going to assemble the figures. I'll do a little bit of kit bashing with some other stuff I've got in my collection. We'll do some scale comparisons with some different manufacturers, and then I'll give you my final thoughts. So that's where we're headed here. Let me isolate just one of these sprues. And then one thing that jumped out at me anyway is that I've only seen like maybe 2 other manufacturers that do these combo sprues of having the mount and the rider on a single sprue. Of course, the main limitation of doing it that way is that it means that the mount is then tied to this set. The reason a lot of companies do 2 separate sprues is so that you can use that like horse sprue with a different set of like mounted knights. For example, in this particular case, the subject matter suggests to me that like they don't intend to make another Halfling Cavalry set, right? Because this represents both light and heavy Halfling Cavalry, and I don't think they have any other reason to represent these like Shire ponies in a set. So it actually makes sense to combine it here. And the normal drawback of doing it this way is that it really cuts into the number of bits that you could provide on a like the rider sprue. We've seen that from a couple of other companies as well. But here you can see there's really no shortage of bits. We'll get to that in a second, but the ponies really only take up the space, and then the bodies of the riders are here, but everything else is accessory, arm, head bits, so that's nice to see. So let's do a shot of the front and back of the sprue here, and then we'll start drilling down into all of the details. Normal production notes apply here, and that's true of, I mean, every Wargames Atlantic set that we've looked at, partly owing to the fact that all these molds are quite new, but there's always very little in the way of mold lines. and really no flash other than this like silly stringy stuff that's in the center sometimes. But you can see like the side of the ponies is probably the best way to look at it. There's going to be very minimal cleanup work required here, which is nice. So let's start with the ponies. I suppose normally on cavalry sets we start with the mounts, and in this case we're just going to be rotating around the center of the sprue here. These look great. I'm very curious to see if these are mix and matchable, like the left and right sides, because that might be the only limitation here, where because we have 2 riders and mounts per sprue, the riders we're not going to have any issue with because there's so many accessories for them. But if these can't be flip-flopped, it's going to, I think, really limit the number of poses. You're going to essentially have 5 duplicate poses inside of a unit. So I'll test that out at the build step. Yeah, the sculpting here looks fantastic. Nice little Shire ponies. And there are actually 3 head options. This is using, if you're not familiar with it, there's a 2-part head and bridle harness. I'll call it a bridle system here, where this is going to attach into the mouth there, and then it sets down onto the front of the pony. It works very well. We've seen this on a number of sets. Most notably their Medieval Knights. I thought it worked quite well because it creates these 3-dimensional reins, which is nice. So yeah, they look really good. The 2 rider bodies here. I'm going to have to flip the sprue over here in a second, but the sculpting here looks great. And barefooted as you would expect from a halfling, but a cool mix of like plate armor here, which I think would work well. Same thing over here. Very similar poses to them, which is fine. Again, it's mostly going to be the accessories. I think they're going to help differentiate all the riders from one another. Let's talk heads here, because there's a ton, given the number of bodies. Again, there's 2 bodies per sprue. There are 16 heads per sprue. So we have 5 of them up here. I'm going to actually categorize them as 9 that are, I think, intended as like War of the Roses inspired, like 15th, 16th century. So there's 5 of those up here, and then there are 4 down here. So there's these 2 that have slightly like open face helms, and these 2, which I initially thought were just loose helmets, you can actually see are like Gothic style knight helms. And then if I flip the sprue over, you'll see that they're like fully enclosed with mouth guards there. So there's 9 that I think are like 15th, 16th century. Right. There are then 5 that are more, I guess this is slightly earlier than Agincourt. So maybe call it like a 12th, 13th century knight. Great helm style helms up here. And then 3 down here, there are these like kettle helms. So lots of options there. You can see, again, because this is per 2 bodies, where you can have them all in these great helms, you can have them all in these kettle style helms if you wanted to. They could have them all with these Gothic helms, all with these like Agincourt or slightly Gondorian looking helmets there. So there's tons to play with there. And then there are 2 bear heads as well if you're going for more of like a light cavalry look to them. So again, 16 heads per 2 bodies. There are then 11 arms. Let's start down here because they actually are pretty well grouped. So there's 3 that are these light lances or javelins down here, and you can see that some of them are upright. There's 1 that's in like a downward thrusting or throwing pose. There are 2 arms here that are like either in a pointing or in this case holding a big old pint. Right. And then there are 4 lances of slightly different styles. So there's this one that's just like a long spear along with that one. This one's quite fancy and fluted, very fantastical looking. And this one looks a lot like one of the jousting style lances that we saw in the Medieval Knights set, just scaled down for a halfling arm, which is awesome. And then there are 2 short sword options down here. So again, 11 arms, and you've got a couple of left arms that are just in a like bracing pose to hold a shield. Speaking of which, there are 2 shields. This might be the only thing from a design standpoint I'm not a huge fan of, just because they look quite aggressive and menacing looking. I would have preferred maybe like just one of their like regular shields from their Medieval Knights, or even like a round shield. I think would look better for a halfling, but those are fine. There's a couple of scabbards down here, one with a sword in it, one without. There's this javelin bundle here, which is pretty cool. And there's, as you would expect for halflings, there's lots of food accessory options. So there's this, I think it's just like a loaf of bread or a pastry of some kind. This loop of sausages, which would go around the neck. I think we saw that depicted on the front too, the illustration there. Pie, all wrapped up. And they're all tied to like bits of leather here so they could be strapped onto the ponies if you wanted to. And there's this little like leg of smoked meat here, I think is what that is. Maybe a wine bottle, but I think it's smoked meat. So there you go. I think these look really cool on the sprue, but I'm curious to see how they look all assembled, and I'm curious to see what kind of kit bashing we can pull off here. So let me cut. I'll see you in a moment. Alright, so I got some of these built up for you, and I owe everybody an apology. I have the Wargames Atlantic Halfling Infantry set in my collection, and I even did the review for it about 6 months ago. And right around the time I did that review, I saw that this set was coming down the pipeline, and I thought, well, let me put these bits, these halfling bits, into a special bag, store them away someplace safe so they don't get mixed in with my regular bits. I don't lose them. And you can probably guess what happened. I lost them. I have no idea where these bits are. I did find a couple of heads, so I can show you some of those conversions here in a moment, but I don't have any of the bodies to cross-reference. They're very similar in scale. I think the only difference you'll find is that the original kit is a little bit more true scale versus the more heroic proportions that we're seeing on the more recent fantasy sets from Wargames Atlantic. But I think all put together, these look really good. They were super easy to put together too. I did find that these ponies, the two halves of them do mix and match between the two halves. So like here's another one. You can see the left side of the pony is the same. And again, I don't do any cleanup work in terms of mold lines, just to show you where they are. So it's a little heavier here on the legs of the ponies, but still not that bad in the scheme of things. But you can see that's the different left half on each of these. So you can see they mix and match just fine. And what that means between the two halves mixing and matching and then three heads is that you actually have, what, you have 12 total unique mounts. So you don't actually have to have the same looking pony anywhere in this set. I think my only critique is that the tails, just like we saw with the medieval knight horses, are like, in my estimation, like 50% too long. It works okay because these are supposed to be like Shire ponies. Here's another one. So the first one was just straight out of the box. This one is the same. No conversion work here. But I think they look awesome. And these are just mounted on 25 by 50 millimeter bases here. So a couple minor conversions here. The first one is with the Wargames Atlantic Medieval Knights. So the head and the lance arm, or excuse me, the lance arm is from this one. This is where it gets confusing because that lance also shows up in the Medieval Knights. But the head is from their Medieval Knights set. So you can see, I think it scales very nicely here, just straight out of the box. And that shield is from the Medieval Knights. So you can harvest some of those bits, get some of like the jousting helms from that set if you wanted to use them here. And then this is actually from the Guards set, the Wargames Atlantic Guards. That head looks quite similar, of course, to several of the heads in this set, but that's a Guard's head, just showing once again that the proportions work pretty well here. And then the arms are both from the Guards set as well. The only snipping I had to do was just at the ends of the arms, just cutting off a couple of millimeters. And that's the kind of thing you should do when you're like dry fitting, just to see how much you want to shave off, because you can always take more off. And then I have a couple of bodies just trialing out different heads for you here. So this is from the Victrix Fantasy Heads set. Again, we're mostly just showing off proportions here. Here's the Wargames Atlantic Le Grenier, I believe. But could just as easily be their Deathfield's upgrade set to make kind of like Krieg type soldiers. Halfling Krieg, I suppose. So this is a bear head from this set that I wanted to juxtapose with one of the bear head, or one of the heads from the Halfling Infantry. So Halfling Infantry on the right, Cavalry on the left. So you see the slight difference in the head size, because again, this one is helmeted. So I don't think it's super noticeable. I think if I were going to leave this conversion, I would cut a little bit of the neck down, just to have it sit closer to the body. But I think you're going to be better off using these heads on the infantry than vice versa. And here's a Oathmark heavy infantry head, which I think also scales quite nicely. And then I ran out of bodies, so I have a kind of blitz of heads here I'm going to trial out, see if this is going to work. So, yeah, so here's a body. So here's another halfling infantry head. So again, I think it's a little bit smaller. I think these heads work better with these bodies. But I think you could also make some goblins out of these, huh? That's I think it's actually an orc head from the Oathmark set. That works just fine. Here's an actual goblin head from the Wargames Atlantic goblins. So you can just paint the toes green. Got yourself a stocky goblin there. Here's another head I thought might interest you. This is from the Victrix Greek Hoplite conversion heads. Just to show you, I think that they scale very nicely. That's the cool thing about halflings, is that goofy proportions are better. And so here's the opposite. So this I think is too small. This is A, and of course you'd have to cut the neck down a little bit too. This is a Perry Miniatures War of the Roses head, just to show you that I think they're a tad small for what we're trying to do here. But what is not, I don't think, so this is an Oathmark Dwarf infantry head, just set straight down on. So if you wanted to make some dwarves, maybe do a little bit of green stuff just to put some like steel-toed boots on the end of the feet, paint them brown. And there you go, you got yourself some dwarf pony cavalry if you wanted to. Let's throw them on the Lazy Susan and see how they all scale up. Alright, some scale comparisons for you. I have moments of doubt a lot. That's probably the OCD, but certainly as it relates to this channel, sometimes I'm like, people don't care about this. But maybe someone out there does. So I'm doing a scale comparison anyway, even though I have doubts that people care about this information. But you can see here, I've got a number of manufacturers spinning. Unlike my proper scale comparison, like infantry figures, these aren't marked. So let me start calling them out as they spin. So in the center, we've got Firelock Games. That is Victrix from their late Roman range. Victrix Medieval. Wargames Atlantic Halfling. Wargames Atlantic Medieval. Fireforge Games. Wargames Atlantic Halfling. Wargames Atlantic Medieval Light Cavalry. Oathmark Human Cavalry. And Wargames Atlantic Halfling. So what's the verdict? It's awesome, right? Like tons and tons of bits. I think that, as we saw at the conversion stage, more than the infantry bits being able to complement this one, I think it's more that these bits, because there's so many heads in here, are going to complement the infantry quite nicely. So we're finally at a place where you could make a whole halfling force out of multi-part plastic, outside of, Mantic's offerings as well. But that's kind of like a mix of resins and metals too. So if you're looking for like a pure multi-part plastic halfling set between the infantry and the cavalry, I think you can come up with some pretty cool stuff. And I would recommend, if you're getting the infantry, again, kind of wait so you can get the cavalry as well, just because you can take these heads and use them to add just a ton of variety to the infantry. Because that's the main problem with the infantry as one of the very first Wargames Atlantic sets. It's a little more limited in terms of the bits that come within the set. But yeah, this is great, obviously, for any kind of role-playing game, D&D. I would make a whole like Warhammer Proxy Empire force out of these guys, or Harfoot Jousting, the newer rule set from Osprey Northstar. So anyway, there's tons and tons of stuff that you can do with these little guys, and they're just oozing with character because they've got so many cool bits that scream halfling. So huge thanks once again to Wargames Atlantic for sending these my way. I'm looking forward now to putting them all together kind of as these little demi-medieval knights, I think is how I'm going to make mine up and get them painted here. So stay tuned for that. Appreciate all you. Lots more reviews to come. Until next time, happy gaming.